when we think of the value of something. In the Old Testament times, a lot of times people would just trade their commodities. Somebody had goats and they needed some wheat. They would trade a goat for a certain amount of wheat or something. So they had ways of figuring out how much something was worth, or they haggled with the other person until they agreed on a just agreement. And what were used for commodities back there often were livestock, crops, clothing was a commodity, and of course, precious metals have always been considered valuable. So those were also around. Um, we remember Joseph was sold to the Ishmaelite caravan that was going to Egypt. He was sold for 30 pieces of silver. Okay. Every time I heard that, I was thinking coins. No, more than likely it was 30 pieces of silver, 30 nuggets of silver that it was sold for. Because coins was not necessarily very often used at that time. We do see in the Bible things like, we'll talk about like a homer, an ephod, a shekel, a hin, and those really are measurements, not a certain value, but certain measurements. It's referring much like we would talk about pounds, gallons, a bushel, or something similar to that. How much is a pound worth? Well, it depends. A pound of what? Right? So it was same thing at that time. The weights that are used, well, it depends what's being weighed to determine how valuable it is. So they did have scales and what we can think of fixed weights. So the weights that they do talk about, they would have rocks that weighed that amount and scales so that they could weigh what they were buying. So if they were trading for wheat, they wanted a certain amount of wheat. Well, they would wait until they got the weight they wanted, and they would then trade for something that they could agree was of equal value. Interestingly enough, the Pentateuch, the law, the Israeli law, the first 5 books of the Bible, it instructs the Israel that they must have just weights. When they were trading, they could not falsify the weights, which was a practice in many societies. There were business people or sellers that would have one weight for buying, a different weight for selling, and whatever was more profitable for them. In Leviticus 19:35 through 36 says, "You shall do no wrong in judgment, in measures of length or weight or quantity. You shall have just balances, just weights, and just ephah, and a just hin. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt." So their weights were supposed to be just, not falsified. So when we get to Old Testament worship and giving, it should not be too surprising to us that what they would take was livestock. They would take grain, they would take food. That's a lot of what they would take. That's what they were commanded to take. There were different types of sacrifice. We think of the lamb, and that was one of the types of sacrifices, but there were quite a few of them. For different reasons, they would take a different type of sacrifice. But I would come in the form of a commodity. So when Israelites were thinking of sacrificing in the temple, it was pretty much equivalent to the way we think of giving an offering. They were giving something to God. They were giving something for the use of God. They would take bulls, lambs, goats, doves. If they were not able to afford a bull or a lamb, there were provisions for the poor where it said you can take a dove. That is not too difficult, that's not too expensive or too hard to get. But they would take something. There were also sacrifices that they would take. There were a grain type of sacrifice. They would take flour, or they would take oil, or they would take frankincense. There was a meal sacrifice as well. And Now, what was the purpose of all these sacrifices, all these gifts that the people would take to the temple? Well, one of them was the whole concept of atonement. We are pretty much familiar with that. We know that taking a lamb, sacrificing, was a symbol of what Jesus would do on the cross. That was very, very symbolic. It would emphasize the idea of sin, guilt, and judgment. It would emphasize the idea of expiation, forgiveness, and reconciliation. That idea was involved in that sacrifice of a lamb. And that was pointing directly to Jesus, the perfect sacrifice that once and for all took care of sin. But there's more to it than that. A lot of their giving was also a devotion to God. Devotion to God. There were the sacrifices for atonement. There were what was a peace sacrifice or a peace offering. Part of that was a thanksgiving offering. There was a free will offering. And a lot of those were people being grateful to God for what He had given them and just wanting to show it. And they will show it in the means of taking a sacrifice, taking a gift to the temple. Now, we need to understand something. In all of this sacrificial system that the law actually detailed step by step exactly what they should bring for each kind of sacrifice, what was to be done with that specific type of sacrifice, and they were supposed to follow that exactly as God commanded. But God was not interested really in the sacrifice as much as He was interested in the heart of the people. That was the main thing that God was interested in. And we see that in a couple of places in later on in the scriptures. I'll read a couple of them. 1 Samuel 15:22. This is where Samuel is confronting Saul because Saul had done something he was not supposed to. And his excuse was, I want to sacrifice to God, but he had been disobedient. And Samuel said, has the Lord as great a delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen than the fat of rams. God was not interested in the sacrifice. He was interested in the heart of the person sacrificing. That was the important part. Hosea 6:6 reflects the same thing. For I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice. This is God speaking to the people through Hosea. The knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. God wanted the heart of the people. They would demonstrate their devotion to God with what they took, with their obedience. That's how they demonstrated their devotion to God. Gratitude was supposed to be the reason they were willing to take these sacrifices. They were supposed to take, one of the offerings they gave was the first fruits. So the first crop that was gathered, the very first thing that was gathered, that belonged to God. The very first of the herd belonged to God. In fact, God always asks for the best, the spotless, the clean, the pure. He asked for the best, and in devotion to God, in gratitude to God, in recognition that God is God and deserves the best, the people were to take this offering to Him. Leviticus 7:11 through 12 talks about the thanksgiving offering. Well, let me read that real quick. And this is the law of the sacrifice of peace offering that one may offer to the Lord. If he offers it for a thanksgiving, then he shall offer it with thanksgiving sacrifice, unleavened loaves mixed with oil, unleavened wafers smeared with oil, and loaves of fine flour well mixed with oil. See, the natural result of gratitude to God is praise. Praise and this willingness to give back. It is interesting that in Hebrews 13:15, praise is called a sacrifice. It's not thinking of, oh, I got to sacrifice something. No, thinking of, I am taking a gift to God. That was the mentality that the Israelites should have. Not, I have to sacrifice, but I am taking a gift to God. And Hebrews 13:15 says, through him then let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God, that is the fruit of lips that acknowledge his name. So gratitude should move us to praise. Gratitude should move us to give, to be willing to give. Now, part of the reason that they gave was to support the priests in their function. The priests, you see, Israel was a theocracy. We look at the United States, it's a democracy. We look at other nations, you have monarchies, you have dictatorships, all different types of government. Well, Israel was a theocracy. And what that means is that their beliefs, their religion, and their government was one. It was together. It was the same thing. What was their law? Well, the Pentateuch, the first five books of the Bible, that's their law. Okay, it was not something separate, but it was a mixed government and religion. And the priests were in charge of, um, well, a lot of different duties. In the temple, they were mediators between God and the people. They were the ones that prayed for the people. They were the ones that went between God and the people. They were overseers of the temple. They performed the sacrifices. They were the ones that took care of the temple, maintained it, did everything that needed to be done. On the Day of Atonement, once a year, the high priest would go into the Holies of Holies, the Holy of Holies, only once a year. And there was a certain ritual, a certain type of sacrifice ritual that was done there. But he was going in on behalf of the people. But they also had civil duties. They were the teachers of the law. They were the ones that knew the law. They were often the judges, and if there were other judges, they were the advisors to the judges. They were the advisors to the king. They oversaw the temple treasury. Became a problem later. And very often the high priest would be the one that would be looked for leadership when there was no king. So it's a mix of church and state, sort of mixed together. The priests were not given any land. They lived among the 12 or the other tribes. They themselves did not get an inheritance. They were dedicated to their service, and God provided for them through the sacrifices of the people. Part of the sacrifices were for the priests to live on. They were able to eat from part of the sacrifices that were done. Deuteronomy 18, I'll just read verse 2. They shall have no inheritance among their brothers. The Lord is their inheritance as he promised them. Well, I guess I should read the end of verse 1. They shall eat the Lord's food offering as their inheritance. So part of the sacrifices was to maintain this group of priests that were in charge of the religious duties and some of the civil duties in Israel. When Israelites went to the temple to worship, they would take a sacrifice. There were feasts that the Israelites would go from all over Israel to the temple for the feast, and they would not go empty-handed. They would take a sacrifice. They would take a gift. This was actually commanded in Exodus 23:15. This is speaking of one of the feasts. It says, you shall keep the feast of unleavened bread. As I commanded you, you shall eat unleavened bread for 7 days at the appointed time in the month of Abib. And in it you came out of Egypt. none shall appear before me empty-handed. And we see that phrase repeated actually a few times. So it was the um, understood directive from God that if you go into the temple, you take something. You take an offering. Now, things had changed by the time we get to Jesus' time. Things had changed. Um, the religious leaders, the priests, for example, well, the whole system was now under Roman authority. Roman came, they overtook there, they were the, we could say, the invading empire that came and took control of Israel. So Rome appointed each of the provinces in Israel with some ruler. Some of them we know as the Herods, Pontius Pilate. These were people that were appointed from Rome to rule a province of Israel. These rulers, Rome itself, allowed the priests to continue type of theocratic government. They continue to rule Israel, to be the ones in charge of Israel. However, they had to obey Roman law. They had to pay taxes to Rome. They had to maintain the peace, otherwise, Roman soldiers would come and take that right away from them. That was one of the fears the priests had, that if the people rose up, that Rome would take away their position. The priestly ruling body was called the Sanhedrin. These were a group of around 70 priests, and they were the government of Israel under Rome. They had to be subject to Rome. Okay, so now let's very quickly talk about the Pharisees and the Sadducees. We hear a lot about them. These are political parties more than anything else. It was a concept, a philosophy, a religious doctrine, a way of thinking. The Sadducees, they valued wealth and power. They were mainly wealthy priests. They were the main part of the Sanhedrin. Okay, and they worked with Rome to keep the peace. They wanted to make sure Rome was okay with them so that they could continue in power. And they really did not care too much about the common people. They were more concerned about themselves. For that reason, they were not really very popular with the common people. The Pharisees, this other political party, they valued admiration and money. Money seems to always creep in there. They kept the law and the traditions legalistically. They added to the law, actually. They were, of these two political parties, they were the larger group. However, they were the minority in the Sanhedrin. Okay, so like I said, this was not like an office or something. It was a political group. Just like today, you might have Republicans that are not congressmen. I mean, just ordinary people can be Republicans or Democrats. Likewise, ordinary people could adhere to the Pharisaical way of thinking or to the Sadducee way of thinking. Okay, so there were a lot of Pharisees, but they were the minority in the Sanhedrin. But they maintained authority or power because the people liked them. The people liked them because they were more closer to the common people than the Sadducees were, and they would actually give alms to the poor. So they were like the people liked them. They gave for the wrong reasons, but the people liked them because they gave to them. And they were teachers of the law. They liked teaching and teaching their teachings, their doctrine, their theology. The scribes, they valued admiration. Some of them valued money as well. Now, the scribes, that's not a political party. The scribes, that's an office. That's a job. That's something that's that they did. There's a scribe basically is someone who writes. We get the word escribir in Spanish from their scribe. That's what it means, someone who writes. They originally they would in ancient Israel they were the ones that would copy the law, copy the Old Testament, and that was their job. And they still would do that. At this time, they would write letters. If you remember, we talked that often letters were written through scribes, that they would use scribes to write letters. Well, that was one of their occupations, that's they would charge for that service. They would write legal documents. They were the ones that would write. Sometimes they are referred to as lawyers because of that. They would write up contracts. So they were the ones that were experts at writing. They were experts at the law because the law had so much to do with what they wrote. And we can see that clearly demonstrated in Matthew 2:4 when the Magi came to Herod looking for the new king. What did Herod do? He called the chief priests and scribes to ask him, where is this new king going to be born? That's in Matthew 2:4. And they knew where the Messiah was to be born. They knew that he was to be born in Bethlehem. Scribes were also often teachers of the law. Because they knew the law, they would often also teach the law. So some scribes were Sadducees, some scribes were Pharisees. Some scribes worked for the temple. So you see scribes with all the different groups. When we see Bible talk about the Sadducees and scribes, or the Pharisees and scribes, that we know that there's scribes that were aligned with them, possibly maybe employees of them. So the system was very corrupt. The worship was corrupt. It was a legalistic type of worship. It was here's a list of rules, just follow the rules, and you are perfectly good with God. That was the whole way of thinking, and people would follow the rules with that type of mentality. If I obey this, and this, I'm perfectly right with God. And we see how Jesus confronted the Pharisees so many times. Now, it was also very money driven. The Sadducees and the priests in the temple, they lived off the offerings that came in. So what came into the temple, that was part of that was what they got. The high priest, Annas, and later his son-in-law and then his descendants for a few generations, they had what was called the bazaars of Annas. When people came to the temple, they would bring an offering, right? And if they were traveling from a far country to come over, it did not make too much sense to bring an animal all the way over. Some would say, I can just go and buy one there in Jerusalem and sacrifice that. So they started setting up booths to sell these lambs and these sacrifices. And there was a couple of things that went really bad about that. One of them was that the priests were to determine whether sacrifices that were brought were proper. It had to be a perfect animal, could not be hurt, could not be sick, could not be, whatever. It had to be a good, proper animal. And they eventually got to the point where whatever was brought from outside, they would basically say, this is not good. Take it away. Go get something else. So the people were forced to go and buy from the sellers there, which were in league with the priests, and they were getting money from there. They also demanded that if they were bringing in an offering, by this time coins were around, they were using money, it had to be a Roman coin. Couldn't be a Jewish coin or some other coin from around there. So they had to make the exchange. And part of those booths that were there were the money changers. And they would change with a charge of about 8%. Whatever people were coming, they would change it to Roman coins, but they would keep 8% of it. And all of this was going in and profiting the high priest, profiting the priests in power. So it was a very, very corrupt system that was going on there. Deuteronomy 28:11 through 14. We read this verse last time, but I want to bring it up again because it gives a promise that was abused by this time. Deuteronomy 28:11 through 14. It says, and the Lord will make you abound in prosperity, in the fruit of your womb, in the fruit of your livestock, in the fruit of your ground, within the lands that the Lord swore to your fathers to give. The Lord will open to you his good treasury, the heavens, to give the rain to your land in the season, and to bless all the work of your hands. And you shall lend money to many nations, but you shall not borrow. Verse 13, and the Lord will make you head and not the tail, and you shall only go up and down if you obey the commands of the Lord your God, which I commanded you today, being careful to do them. If you do not turn aside from any of these words, I command you today to do the right hand or the left hand to go after other gods to serve them. So a very strong promise to the Israelites. You serve me, I will bless you. And actually, a little bit later on, it gives the opposite. If you don't obey me, you will get these curses. Now, this was taken and taught out of context. You see, by this time, the religious leaders were not considering serving, loving God, being grateful to God. They were thinking, do these things and God will give you. And that type of teaching then interpreted to, if you are wealthy, it is because God has blessed you. It is because you are righteous and God is blessing you. And that's why you are wealthy. And that was the concept that people had. To earn God's blessing, you got to go and give. If you want God to bless you, go and give. And people would buy into that type of concept. One of the places where this is seen is in Mark 10:25 through 26. Jesus is teaching here, and he's just talked to a rich young ruler who was not willing to let his money go. He considered his money more important than God. And Jesus says this, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom. Verse 26, and they were exceedingly astonished and said to him, then who can be saved? See, what were they thinking? Well, they're reasoning. If the rich that are blessed by God, if these righteous people that have money because they are blessed by God, if they can go to heaven, then who can go? Then who can be saved? So that was the mentality that people were buying into. And that was indeed the teaching of the religious leaders. Give to us, and God will bless you. Does that sound familiar? We see that teaching in our time. In our time. It became popular in the 1980s, and I thought it was fading away. Looked it up. It's actually increasing in popularity. It's increasing in popularity. That is the prosperity gospel. Those are the main points of the prosperity gospel. I looked up some of their key theological pillars. Let me read them to you. Atonement for health and wealth. The prosperity theology teaches that Jesus' atoning sacrifice on the cross not only saves us from sin, but also provides freedom from sickness and poverty in this life. That's a false doctrine they teach. Second false doctrine, divine favor. Believers are taught that God's favor is demonstrated through material wealth and physical well being, and that those most devout to Him will experience these blessings. Another false teaching. And that's what the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes were teaching at the time. Positive confession. Believers are encouraged to use their words to confess or declare positive outcomes, believing that their positive thoughts and words can manifest in desired results. That is a false teaching. The give to get principle. Give financially to get to God and Christian leaders is considered an act of sowing seeds that will result in a greater material return, often referred to as the seed faith principle. That is another false teaching. And a lot of this were being taught back then. These teachings take advantage of the needy. They take advantage of the poor. You need money, give to us, God will give you much more. That is what is being taught, and that is not what the Bible teaches. Whenever we hear anything like that, we need to make sure we understand and know that's false. That is, and that's been around before Christ's time. That was already being taught. It exploits the vulnerable. And Jesus made an observation. This is during the time that we call Passion Week. This is just before he goes to the cross. And they were in the temple, in an area of the temple that we know as the women's court. Not because only women could go there, but because that's as far as the woman could go. The other area only men could go into. But they were in this court, in this area, they were offering boxes. These offering boxes, they were set up for different purposes. There were 13 of these boxes set up throughout that area, and each one was labeled for a certain thing. If it's a peace offering, it's for this one here. If it's a free will offering, it's for this one here, and so forth. They were boxes, and they had on top a metal funnel-like thing. It's sometimes described as a trumpet. So it's wider and then narrows down and then opens up into a box. And people would drop their coins in there. By this time, money was what was used, so they would bring in their coins. So when a wealthy person came in, they had a lot of coins. They would drop in a whole bunch of coins into this metal funnel, and those things would be clinging all the way down, making all sorts of noise. And everybody would hear it and say, oh, they put in a huge offering. There is someone that's been blessed by God, that's somebody that must be righteous. They're putting in a huge offering. So you could tell the size of the offering by the noise it made. Now in Luke 21, 1 through 4, Jesus is in this court and he makes an observation. It says, Jesus looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts into the offering box. And he saw a poor widow put in 2 small copper coins. And he said, truly, I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them. For they all contribute out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, put in all that she had. So these verses are talking about a free will offering. For most others, there was a specific amount that should be given. Free will offering is you gave whatever you wanted. Okay, and this is an offering that was given beyond the 10th, and beyond the second 10th, and beyond the third 10th. You know, there were 3 tenths that the Israelites gave. 2 of them were given every year. 1 of them was given every 3 years. Okay, maybe we'll talk about that at some time. That's interesting. So the offering at this point was being used for the upkeep and beautification of the temple. Yeah, that's what it was being used for. Now we got to understand that the common Jew was not well off. We live in the US, and by far the largest group in the US is the middle class. That was not the case back then. That was not the case. The largest group was the poor. Then you had a few that were very wealthy, and you would have some in the middle. But the average Jew was not really doing very well. Many of them were barely keeping afloat. They had to pay their taxes to Rome. That was a requirement. They had to give their tenth and second tenth and third tenth to the temple. And they were now being taught that, hey, you want God's blessing? Give more. One of the tenths that was collected was supposed to go for the needy. It was supposed to be for the needy, which included the widows. The widows, there were widows, some that would have children and their children could take care of them. There were widows that had nobody. This would the King James called them destitute. I think the English Standard Version talks about them as poor widows because they had nobody to take care of them. And what we see here is that the temple, instead of helping the poor, they were taking their money. This now I think that Jesus was pointing that out in this story. Excuse me. I think that he was pointing out first off how the rich were given. They thought they were doing really good, but they were giving their leftovers. Okay, and this they were not giving correctly. And that is why Jesus said, she gave more than all of them. An interesting way of putting it. They put in a whole bunch of money, but hers, by God, was seen as more because it wasn't just something given as from their access, from their extra. They gave out of their extra. In Mark 12:38 through 40, in the Gospel of Mark, this verse is immediately before the story of the widows. And in fact, in the Gospel of Luke, it's exactly the same situation. Immediately before the story of this widow that gave the 2 mites, Jesus said, and in his teaching, he said, beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and like greetings in the marketplace and have the best seats in the synagogue and the place of honor at feasts, who devour widows' houses, and for a pretense they make long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation. God has just pointed out how some leaders, in this case the scribes, were taking advantage of the widows. And it's immediately after that that we get this story of this poor widow putting in a little bit and Jesus pointing that out. And I really do think he's pointing out, highlighting the corrupt system. The corrupt system. The rich would display their apparent blessings by how much they gave, but they were given in error. They were given wrongly. Jesus taught that we should give in secret, not to be seen of others. In Matthew 6:22 and 23, it says, thus when you give the needy, sound no trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, for they may be praised by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. So others were looking at them and saying, wow, look at how much they gave. But that's the only reward they're getting. They're getting nothing from God. So, but when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Do not give to display. The rich gave their tenth legalistically. They said, God said 1/10, I'll give 1/10, and that's all I need to give. That's it. They would count their grains to give exactly 1/10. And with that, God should be satisfied. I've been obedient. I gave 1/10. I've done what He said I should give. Do you understand the error in that type of giving? Giving just to fulfill a law, just to fulfill this commandment, and not because you love God. And giving in order to gain a blessing, and not because you love God. They gave of their leftovers. They had already taken care of their needs. They had already taken care of their wants, of their luxuries, and they gave of their leftovers. And that's why it was wrong. That's why it was wrong. Jesus does not command us to empty out our bank account and give everything. He does not command us to sell everything that we owe and bring it into the church. Does not command that. He might tell that to some people, but that's not a general commandment. But we are to give. And we are to sacrifice our luxuries to give. That He is pleased with. When we say, well, I don't need another car just yet. I can wait on that so I can give to God. I don't need to go to Tejas de Brazil or Papa Do's and spend $30 on a plate when I can eat for less, and that way I'll have money to give to God. Those are the things that God does look at, that He does look at. The rich men were given from their leftovers. Okay? We need to give not what we don't have. We need to give what's we need to give from what God gave us. I was remembering something I read on the prosperity gospel, that there were some preachers that were telling the people that had credit card debt. We talked about credit cards some time back. And they were actually stating, max out your credit cards and give to us, and God will pay your credit cards within the month. They were actually telling people that. Can you imagine that? And people fell for it. People wanting for God to bless them and give them something back fell for that and did that. Of course, that never happened. And the poor ended up poorer. And the wealthy preachers bought houses, private jets, mansions here and there, and all sorts of stuff off of the poor. Now, how do we give today? I think it's the second to last slide. Okay, should be able to get it here. Thank you. Okay, how do we give today? First thing we need to understand is this: God does not need your money. Okay? Understand that. God does not need your money, does not need my money. Haggai 2:8, God speaking says, the silver is mine, and the gold is mine, declares the Lord of hosts. He owns it all. He owns it all. He does not need. God is not in need, never has been, and never will be. Now, I've heard some statements by well-intended people say, if you don't give, God's work will not be done. If you don't participate, God's work will not be done. And I think of that, and I think, how small is your God? See, God's work will be done. If our church does not provide for the needy, God will raise one that will. If our church does not proclaim the gospel of salvation, God will raise one that will. If our church does not provide for missionaries, God will raise one that will. God does not need us to do his work. His work will continue. The real question is, are we going to be a part of God's great work? Will we be a part of it, or will we be on the sidelines? When we give to the church, it is used for many different ministries, many different things. One of them is the upkeep. How many of you feel warm today? It'll probably take money to get that fixed. Okay, and the different things that need to be upkept on an ongoing basis. These things never end. Um, there are expenses that need to be done. We need to have lights. We got to have water. Everything's got to be working when we're here. We got to pay the staff, our one staff person, right? Who I can guarantee you is not getting rich, not even close. And there are different programs that are funded. There are different programs that are funded through the church offering, through what's given to the church. Different types of ministries, different types of educational material. There are social activities where we build relationships, which is part of the ministry. And all of that is funded through what we give. When we give, we should give not because we have to, but because we believe in the ministry of the church. Because we believe that when we give to the church, we're giving to God because the church is doing God's work. That should be our motive for giving. We give because we believe what the church is doing. We give because we believe the church should do more. If we think the church should do more, we need to give more so there will be those resources. And we give from a grateful heart. Mentioned earlier, since the Old Testament, God wants the heart. It's not the money he's after. He can get the money from wherever he wants. He wants the heart. Psalms 50:23 says, "The one who offers thanksgiving as his sacrifice glorifies me. To one who orders his way rightly, I will show the salvation of God." Giving with thanksgiving, giving with a grateful heart, that pleases God. 2 Corinthians 9:7 also tells us that we need to give with joy. We need to give with joy. Each one must give as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. Let me make this statement. If you are not happy about your giving, don't give it. Don't give it. Instead, pray to God to change your heart. Don't give until he does. The heart has to be right. God is not after our money, he's after our heart. The heart has to be right. That has always been the case from the Old Testament. We see it in the New Testament, Matthew 5:23 and 24. It gives us one example of this. It says, if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go first be reconciled with your brother and then come and offer your gift. Get your heart right first and then give. If you give because you feel you have to, don't give. Pray to God to change your heart. So Jesus highlights the importance of an upright heart over the money itself, over the offering itself. Now, the reason money is so important in our spiritual life, I say it's because it demonstrates where our heart is. It demonstrates what we value. You want to analyze your heart? Look at your bank statement. Look at your credit card statement. Where's your money going? That tells you what you value. What you're willing to invest in, that's what you value. What you consider the most valuable, that's what you spend your money and your time on. Your money and your time. When we talk about stewardship, let me remind you, it involves money. It's not money only. It's all that we are. Our time, our talents, our abilities. So what we do with our time, our abilities, and our money, that demonstrates where our heart is at. And will we invest on things that will be forgotten in 50 to 100 years? Or will we invest in things that are eternal? That's something for us to think about. And I will conclude with today's verse that I had not gone to. But I think this will hit stronger because of what we've been talking about. Matthew 6:19 through 21. Do not lay up for yourself treasures in heaven where moth and rust destroy. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourself treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Let's stand. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, God, we look at your work and it touches us, it teaches us, it cuts to our heart, Father, and it teaches us different things that um, perhaps we knew and didn't understand, perhaps we had not quite gotten, but your Spirit works without spirit to sort of help us understand, to sort of help us realize things that we might need to change in our lives, things that we need to get right, things that we need to correct in our lives, Father. And we ask you that we be always obedient to your Spirit as it teaches us, Father. Help us to look at our finances. Help us to look at our heart and see what it is that we are willing to spend our money in, Lord, and to see if that aligns with the heart that you want for us to have, God. See if that aligns with the priorities that we as Christians are supposed to have, Father. So I ask that you help us to see your priorities and then to obey and align our priorities to yours. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Praise God from